when you're looking at disruptive technology, something that could just change the way we work or, or play, what have you. I guess my concern is always that idea of Betamax versus VHS, right? Betamax was these two competing technologies, and by and large, a lot of people were thinking Betamax was going to win that fight, and that just wasn't the case. So maybe describe a little bit of your process of kind of figuring out who the leader is going to be, and do you ever have to make changes along the way when it looks like things are shifting in a different direction than you thought?
Yes. So, that's an example that we talk about often internally as well. When we define what disruptive innovation is and what that means for us, I guess what's investable, right?
Hmm.
We try to look for technologies that are really changing the world, but more so, we look for disruptions that are we say like cross industry. So they're not just sort of standalone innovations; they're affecting many things at once. We also tend to look for things that have nice cost decline curves. We model a lot of technologies using Wright's law. It's a derivation of Moore's law to determine that cost decline. And then thirdly, we look for platform innovations. So again, not standalone, something that you can actually build other things on top of. The internet would be like the prime example of
Hmm.
something like that. And we talk a lot about market dynamics, and at ARK, we actually we call it living research. So we're constantly tweaking, reevaluating things. I've been working on a model for autonomous driving for the past 8 years now, and I revisit it every year and make changes and tweaks. And we talk about like what makes not just a technology interesting on its own, but what would make it adopted by users. So that's kind of where you get into the cost decline, but also um, you know, for in the case of things like AI and robotics, sometimes we talk about what's called backwards compatibility, meaning like you want the technology to be easily fit into our current world because that's the quickest way to get it adopted. So the dynamics are different for sort of every technology and industry that we're talking about here, but yeah, that's what we like to discuss all day.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so and your and obviously ARC's research is fantastic. Where in the process is it where an idea that you've modeled well and you've done tons of research and had a lot of optimism on, where in that process did you figure out, okay, maybe it's going to be more the Betamax, where it is going to be wrong, and we thought that it was a great technology, but for whatever reason, the world is just not going to adopt it, and this is no longer a great stock idea anymore.
Yeah, I think you put it in the right way, which is really it starts with the technology first and then translates into sort of how we adjust our portfolio or specific names that we're looking at. But it can be really early on in a process. The first thing we do is decide if the technology is investable. It meets all of our criteria. So something that I looked at a while ago was actually graphene, because part of what I cover is innovative materials, but there's not a lot of ways to play that in the public markets right now.
Yeah,
And
that's
the way that we
interesting.
decided, okay, it's not investable is graphene's being used, but it's for kind of niche applications. It's used in tennis rackets. It's like questionable exactly what the benefits of that are. There's a lot of research money being poured into it and papers being written, but like what are actually the commercial applications? And it might take 20 years for those to
Right.
develop. So that might be something that we'll wait on. But it's really an iterative process. We're sort of constantly revisiting our theses and sort of changing our mind as soon as we have new information.
Hmm.
And is there a point? I mean, is there kind of every year maybe you're kind of refreshing the ideas or anything like that, or where it's like we're wrong on the like a certain number of ideas you're wrong on, you kind of get rid of them, or it just depends on just how the market evolves in each of the industries?
Yeah, I'd say, in terms of the core ideas, what makes up the portfolios, before you'd get a lot of exposure, like for instance, autonomous technology and robotics, before we create that strategy, we'd be pretty sure about those technologies and that they have staying power. So,
Okay.
and then it would be more of a question of, okay, which company is doing this
Right.
correctly? And then it comes more down to the fundamentals of that particular name, the execution of the management team, sort of how we like how things are playing out. within the 5-year window that we look at for our time horizon.
Mhm.
So that's sort of how to think about it there.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned this iterative process, and you mentioned a model that you've been working on for the last 8 years that you revisit every 8 years. I mean, every year. Can you go ahead and maybe give us a little bit of the details? Probably not everything, of course, but kind of how you went through your process of creating that model and what it is that you look at in order to improve it.
Yeah. So all right. So I'll tell you the basics of what the model is I tried to estimate what would be the price that you could charge for an autonomous taxi ride, and how big will that market be? So, top line is I think this market will be measured in the trillions over the next 5 to 10 years. This could be up to $11 trillion in enterprise value for the autonomous taxi platform providers. And I think that autonomous taxis are interesting because they could undercut the price of taxis today, but also the cost of personal travel or driving your own
Hmm.
car. So
Right.
an autonomous taxi could be priced as low as 25 cents per mile. The average cost to drive a new personal car in the US is around 70 cents per mile. So I think there'll be like a bunch of price points in between there. But the
Hmm.
point is, it could be cheap, and that's what would be attractive to consumers, along with a lot of other safety benefits.
Hmm.
The process of doing that is, it's kind of, I just read it as much as I can and talk to as many people as I can. It's academic research. It's reading all the news articles about the companies that are really on top of this space. We have at ARK what we call our theme developer network, which is a group of people. They're academics, they're other investors, they're industry professionals, maybe CEOs or founders themselves. And we talk about every week with them the most interesting research ideas that popped up that week. And it's part of our process to refine that living research.
And what about testing out the kind of a robo-taxi? Like, for instance, I think like GM has the cruise going around San Francisco. Have you had a chance to go and try that one out?
So I haven't had a chance to go in a cruise vehicle quite yet. I know that they're starting to get investors in cars, so I look forward to doing that soon.
Yeah.
I have ridden in a Waymo vehicle in Phoenix.
Hmm.
Actually, I did a cross country road trip, and we stopped in Arizona just for that purpose, so we could
That's
test out the
awesome.
car.
And so you
How
could
was
And
write off the trip.
yeah, right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
well,
Um,
how
And
was it? How was it, Tasha? Just driving around. What was kind of your experience then?
yeah, I mean, okay, I think the most exciting things about those cars being on the road is it's here and it's possible. Like,
Yeah.
when I first started researching autonomous cars 8 years ago, is this question of, will this happen in our lifetime? Is it really a thing? And it's not a question anymore.
mhm.
So I think the ride was pleasant, uneventful, like many people say. Of course, Waymo's constrained to like a very specific operating area.
Right.
But within that operating area, I think it performs surprisingly well. In that, actually, my fiance at the time was next to me, and we took it like 10 minutes somewhere, 10 minutes back, and on the way back he was just on his phone the whole time because he trusted the car. So I think that says a lot.
Nothing to see here anymore. It's
Yeah, right.
this is old
He
hat
was
after
bored.
10
Yeah.
minutes. Right.
Well,
Yeah.
I know
That's
the
just a
first time.
drive.
Well, I know the first time I tried like Uber, I couldn't get over the fact that there was a random car coming, and so I was freaking out the whole time. So I can't even imagine how I'd react going in a robotaxi, and just having a drive without a driver there. But so yeah, you two definitely handled it a lot better than I would.
Hey, I think we have to do a road trip to
We might
Phoenix,
have to,
maybe.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Do the podcast
Yeah.
from there. So,
Report
so,
back.
so now with some of this stuff, I mean, there's the innovation side,
Hmm.
and I mean, that's something that just doesn't work on a deadline, right? When you're working on these
Yeah.
technologies that you have to like create, and you just don't know like how soon until. But then there's this other variable, the regulation side, that's
Yes.
also huge. So when you're kind of coming up with your timeline, how do you work with those things that don't necessarily work on the deadlines that you might be putting forth?
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the reasons that ARK was created as an investment firm that's focused on the long term is because when you're looking at these emerging technologies, you have to have a longer time period. I mean, this is not it's not a question of what was the quarter readout, right? So we have a 5-year time horizon, but the research often extends past that. It could go 10 years, sometimes even a little bit further. Of course, it's harder to predict then. And that's also, you mentioned timeline as we're talking about like how we refine our research. That's something that I've changed in my autonomous car model because, when I first started looking into this, every automaker said that they'd have an autonomous car by 2020. And that didn't happen. From a technical basis, it proved to be a lot challenging than even, the best players expected. So, I adjusted my time period accordingly, sort of as we got closer and closer to being able to tell, like, when is this really going to commercialize? But I really think the most important thing as an investor is to keep your eye on the long term.
And so we're all pretty familiar with the autonomous vehicles these days. But go into some of the other kind of areas that you're looking at. I mean, you mentioned drones.
Yeah.
Yeah, what kind of innovation are you seeing going on there, or maybe some of the newer parts within the drone field?
Yeah, so the research that I've done on drones has mainly been on the delivery side. So,
Mm,
and
yeah.
it's a really exciting time because we've started to see actually, and you mentioned regulation too. Well, first I'll say regulation is it's certainly a risk to investing in these areas, and the way to deal with it as an analyst will be, you sort of model that accordingly because it's an item of uncertainty, and we can't
Right.
exactly to predict when a regulator will approve something. So you build in a margin of error to your forecast, essentially. But with autonomous cars, we've actually been really lucky on the regulation side because the U.S. is actually one of the most forward-thinking, or maybe we'll say it just happened to be the case that the responsibility lied with the states and not the federal government. So things happened a lot sooner than you'd expect with a new technology. Drones, the regulation is much more of a big deal in this area, and understandably so. But COVID has given us, the first, I'd say like it's kickstarted the drone trials because one of the first applications of delivery is medical deliveries. Right now in Rwanda, for instance, more flights are unmanned than are manned. And
Wow.
it's because a company called Zipline has been delivering blood there for a number of years. And it's a trip that would take maybe 2 days or something on a motorbike, and you could do it in 15 to 30 minutes with a
Oh,
drone.
wow.
So it's super disruptive,
Mhm.
especially in emerging markets. Like here in the US, you can think that would be more rural areas, right?
Mhm.
So autonomous cars, city centers, drones will be for areas that don't have like as many restaurants that deliver to your house, right? If you live in
Mhm.
a more let's say like further suburban or rural area, you'll all of a sudden get more options and more convenience as a consumer. And ultimately, similar to autonomous cars, we think it'll also be cheap. So where the real innovation is.
Mhm. Well, that's certainly a lot to think about. Any other areas? I mean, you mentioned autonomous, the drones. What about some of the robotics areas in other areas?
Yes. So within robotics, we look a lot at collaborative robots.
Okay.
And also I'd say this is kind of a subset of robotics. It's a robot in a way. 3D printing is one of my
Hmm.
other specialties. So this is a technology that it really brings the cost to innovate down because the cost to make a prototype becomes
Right.
extremely cheap. Low volume parts become extremely cheap. Really complex parts all of a sudden become way easier to make than they were. So for healthcare, that has great applications. If you think of any implant that's custom built to the human body versus like an off the shelf part, you can
Hmm.
see how that's better. It cuts down on time in the operating room. And then for things like manufacturing, actually, a lot of the, you could imagine in the future that a drone that has a specific application, we think there'll be a proliferation of form factors here in autonomous vehicles. So different applications have different vehicles, attending to them. That's something that could really suit itself well to 3D printing because it's a low volume part, but
Hmm.
you can iterate quickly and sort of produce it on demand in a way that you couldn't before.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching Investors Business Daily on YouTube. If you want to watch more videos, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a thing.